So I'm Jennifer Hancock. This is Ask a Humanist for September. And today's program is all about adjectives. There's a lot of adjectives that come with humanism. There's humanism, there's secular humanism, there's ethical humanism, religious humanism, Jewish humanism, Buddhist humanism, transhumanism, Renaissance humanism, academic humanism, and we could go, philosophic humanism, we could go on. There's a lot of adjectives. And it confuses a lot of people. And some of these adjectives are organizational markers. They tell you what organization someone's affiliated with. Other ones tell you what people think is important about the philosophy. And some have nothing to do with the philosophy of humanism and everything to do with academics and history. So it's a little bit confusing because humanism actually has two definitions. One is a modern definition, and that's the one we think that I'm a philosophic humanist. When I call myself a humanist, I'm telling you that my philosophy of life is humanism. There's also humanists who are scholars of the humanities. So it's a little bit confusing because they're not the same thing. A scholar of the humanities may or may not be a philosophic humanist. So let's talk about what philosophic humanism is, and then we'll talk about what some of these adjectives are to help kind of explain it. I'm going to use the American Humanist definition of humanism, which is that humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that, without supernaturalism, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity. In other words, live life fully, leave the world a better place, and love your fellow human beings in the process. Just be a good person. Now, I consider myself a humanist. I don't put adjectives in front of the word because I think all aspects of the philosophy are important, and I'm not concerned with organizational affiliation. And this is going to make a little bit more sense when I start talking about the adjectives. Now, the main adjective that people are aware of is secular, as in secular humanism. Now, most of the adjectives, like secular, are actually redundant. They're part of humanism already. So when you're saying secular humanism, you're saying I'm a secular secularist. So it is redundant. And, if you say I'm a philosophic humanist, you're saying I'm a philosophic philosopher. And if you say I'm an ethical humanist, I'm an ethical ethicist, it's redundant. It really is. Because humanism is a philosophy, it's an ethical philosophy, and it's a secular ethical philosophy. So all of that's embodied in the word humanism, which is one of the reasons why I don't use the adjectives. Now, most people who use the term secular humanist do so for one of two reasons. Well, actually three. There's probably 3 or 4 reasons. We're not going to limit the reasons. One of the reasons is because they found humanism through the secular movement, and specifically through the Council for Secular Humanism, which is part of the Center for Inquiry. So they're not aware that there's necessarily other forms of humanism that are the same. The Council for Secular Humanism is a humanist group. They just happen to emphasize secularism, but not at the exclusion of all the other aspects of the philosophy, certainly. But when I hear someone tell me they're a secular humanist, it usually tells me that they're coming out of the secular movement, that they found humanism through the secular movement. Which is fine. Nothing wrong with that. Or it tells me that their primary organizational affiliation is with the Council for Secular Humanism or the Center for Inquiry, which is the parent group of the Council. They could also just like the way it sounds. So there's a lot of reasons why someone might use the term secular. The point is that all humanists are secularists. They're all secular. Humanism is a secular philosophy. There is not a religious form of humanism. Humanism as a term was coined in the early 1900s, around 1950, late 1800s, early 1900s, when there was a vibrant free thought movement in America. They had free thought churches and things like that. And some UU ministers came up with this term humanism to describe what they felt was a non-religious approach to ethics, like almost a non-theistic approach to ethics that would be kind of religious in nature. It wasn't just a philosophy, but it was not a religion either. And so they called this thing humanism. And that's the origin of the term humanism as a philosophy. The term for this philosophy didn't exist before those UU ministers kind of came up with this term. Now, there were humanists before that, but they were the academic teachers of the humanities type of humanist as opposed to the philosophic humanist. Now, my family, I'm third generation free thinker on both sides of my family. So my family was actually involved in the free thought communities of Chicago. And we didn't have a name for our philosophy. It didn't have a name. We just called it being a good person. And it's kind of like, why does being a good person need its own ism? Right? So we didn't have a name. I only found out about the humanist community when I moved to Florida, and that there was this thing, an actual community of humanists, and that there was a name for this philosophy, that someone had thought to give it a name. And how brilliant is that? Because it really does need its own name to distinguish it from other approaches to living an ethical life. So all philosophic humanism is, by definition, secular. The term was coined to describe specifically a secular approach to ethics. All humanism, and let me say this again because I hear this from secular humanists all the time, they are absolutely convinced there's a religious form of this philosophy. There isn't. Right? Humanism refers to a secular philosophy. What happens is that there's also the humanities version of humanists, some people that are humanities scholars that call themselves humanists, and they may or may not have been recognizable as a philosophic humanist that we recognize as philosophic humanism here and now. Now, they might have been humanistic, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of this, because this really is the first thing. So you have academic humanism, which is the humanities, and you have a long tradition of humanists studying the humanities going back in time. And if you type in humanism, you're liable into the Googles, you're liable to come up with Renaissance humanism as one of your options. And Renaissance humanism really is speaking not to philosophic humanism, but the rediscovery of the humanities as a field of study during the Renaissance. And the scholars of the humanities were called humanists. And it's very obvious that most of these men were religious, and which is why there's some confusion about whether or not there's a religious form of humanism or not. We're talking about two completely different things. There's academic humanities, the scholars of which are called humanists, and there's the philosophy of humanism, which was coined in the late 1800s, 1900s, and described as a philosophy then. And the practitioners of that philosophy are also called humanists. But the word humanist means two different things. So you cannot assume that a Renaissance academic scholar of the humanities who called themselves a humanist was also what we would recognize today as a philosophic humanist. And you actually see this now that there is a term for this specifically non-religious, non-supernatural approach to ethics that resembles a religion but isn't a religion because it's a philosophy. We can now look back on the philosophers of history and kind of point to them and say this person was a humanist philosopher as we would recognize them today, or they were humanistic as we would recognize them today, or they weren't humanist at all. And that's actually, a really great way to classify ancient philosophies. It's a really helpful way to describe it. And again, it comes back to, why did it take so long for humans to name this philosophy? That's always been around. So when you go back and you look at the Renaissance humanists, which is again scholar of humanity humanist, you can classify them as humanist, humanistic, or not humanist at all in the philosophic sense. But that doesn't mean they weren't a humanist in the academic sense. Two totally different things. So do not confuse the uses of this word and say that because some of these academic humanists of the Renaissance were religious, that means that there's always been a religious humanism. The philosophy was not described until the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it has always referred to a secular philosophy. That's what it was coined. Now, has the philosophy always been around? Well, yeah, we can go back as long as we have writings and see that there were secular humanists throughout history. We just didn't give their philosophies names because that's not how things were done. We call Confucianism Confucianism because of the guy named Confucianism. And we call, just as we call Christianity Christianity because of the guy Christ. Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ. Buddhism is named after a guy. So we talk about the philosophy of the individual and not necessarily the movement, but now we can go back and say these several philosophers were humanists, these several philosophers were humanistic, and these several philosophers were religious. So humanism, even in that context, as we look back at historical philosophers, is again very helpful because there has always been, throughout the entire history of humanity, a non-religious, non-supernatural approach to living an ethical life, which is what humanism is. So all humanism is secular. When you find the adjective secular in front of humanism, it's referring either to an organization, the Council for Secular Humanism, or it's referring to how this person found humanism and how they were first exposed to it. Or they're telling you that out of the entirety of this philosophy, which includes, a call to social action, personal responsibility, a sense of human agency, ethics, and secularism, that they think out of all of that, secularism is the most important aspect of the philosophy. It might be the driving motivation of their personal approach to living life as a humanist. And all of that's fine. But it doesn't mean that any other form of humanism is not also secular, right? Because all humanism is secular except for the academic form, which is about the humanities and not about the philosophy. Now, there's another term that you're going to come across in America, and that is ethical humanism. And we have an American Ethical Culture Society. Now, originally it was called the Ethical Culture Society, and they didn't use the term humanism because they were a rival group to the people who came up with the term. And actually, the guy that founded the Ethical Culture Society rejected the term humanism or humanist when it was applied to him. But most ethical humanists have long since come to terms with the fact that, yes, we're talking about the same thing. Ethical culture is humanism. Humanism is what ethical culture was describing as well. It's two terms describing the same thing. So again, what you have is you have people who call themselves ethical humanists. And what they're telling you is about their organizational affiliation. They're members of the Ethical Culture Society. That's how they found humanism, is through the Ethical Culture Society. And it doesn't mean they're not secular humanists, because humanism is both ethical and secular. That they just either think that the ethics of humanism is the most important part of the philosophy, or it's a statement of organizational affiliation. It's the same as with secular humanism. Right? Organizational affiliation first and foremost. Entry into the philosophy and discovery of the philosophy second. What the person personally thinks is important about the philosophy third. And you're going to find this pattern with all the adjectives. You also have, natural humanism, which doesn't have an organization, but when someone says they're a natural humanist, what they're saying is that the focus on the natural world as opposed to the supernatural world is what's really important to them. And yes, that is incredibly similar to secular humanism. It's the same thing. It's describing the same thing. This is all the same thing. All right. So you can actually pretty much ignore the adjectives if you want to. It's much easier to say humanism anyway, as opposed to putting the adjective in front. And one of the reasons I encourage people to do that, to just say humanism when what you mean is humanism, rather than segregating yourself into an organizational affiliation, is because when you say things like, I'm a secular humanist, the focus is no longer on humanists, the focus is on secular. When you say I'm an ethical humanist, the focus is no longer on the humanism as a full-fledged philosophy, it's on the ethics. So that's what I see as the problem with these adjectives. The other thing, especially with the secular humanist label, is people don't know what the word secular means. The average person you meet in the supermarket doesn't know what secular means. And they guess it means sect, and then when they hear it with an ism or an est, like secular humanist or secular humanism, they think sect and ism means cult. I don't want to have anything to do with cult. So a lot of the people that we want to be part of the humanist movement, who would normally be very excited about the humanist movement, when they hear the term secular humanist, are actually frightened by the term and turn away from us for exactly the same reasons we want them to. We would if we thought we didn't know what the word meant. So we have to be very careful to use words that people know. So let's talk about the next adjective that you'll hear, which is religious humanism. Now, this one is not like the other adjectives because there is no supernatural or theological element to humanism. Humanism is by definition a secular philosophy of life that without supernaturalism affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment. And it always has been since the philosophy was first described 100-ish years ago. So what is this religious humanism thing? Well, it turns out that when the word was first being bandied around and when there was these conversations in kind of intelligentsia circles about the need for a secular ethic, a secular approach to being an ethical person, one of the ways of promoting this approach was considered the religious model, that we should kind of replace traditional supernatural-based religions with a secular religion, and that secular religion would be humanism or ethical culture. And so what you're really talking about with religious humanism is not that it's religious, but that it's being used as a religion as opposed to as a philosophy. Now, for me, humanism is a philosophy. And I see that in how people take bits of it and use it in their daily lives. It's a very practical, pragmatic philosophy, and it works really, really well. It makes my life better. But some people like to think of humanism as an alternative to religion, and so they will talk about being religious humanists. It doesn't mean that they believe in anything supernatural. They don't, because they're humanist, and humanism is by definition secular. It just means that they like organizing in a religious model. They like the community that a religious group provides. And for them, humanism is not simply a philosophy, it's more like their religion. It's still secular, it's still without supernaturalism, but for them it's a religion. So that's what someone who's saying they're a religious humanist is saying. Not that they're religious in the traditional sense, but that they're a humanist who views humanism as religion. Or, again, that they are affiliated with a group that considers humanism to be a religion. This might include you humanists. It might include members of the Ethical Culture Society. You never know. Now, so I mean, that's what please ask me questions below if this is not clear to you. I'm hoping it is. And I understand it's really confusing because, you come into the humanist movement and you see all these adjectives and they don't always mean what you think they mean. And if you hear secular humanist and religious humanist, it's natural to assume that one is secular and one is religious, but that's not what the origin of these terms are, and it's not how they're used by the individuals who use these terms. I have yet to meet someone who is a religious humanist who has any belief in the supernatural at all. It's literally they treat humanism as a religion. And they think of humanism as a religion, not as a philosophy, where people like me consider it to be a philosophy. And ultimately, I don't think it matters whether it's a philosophy or a religion, to each its own. If the philosophy and the tenets of the philosophy help you live a better life, I think that's what's ultimately important. But it's all secular. It's all secular. All right, so let's talk about the actual religious pairings when you pair religion with humanism, because that happens too. So you have a congregation for humanistic Judaism. You also have secular Jewish humanists. You also have Buddhist humanists and Muslim humanists and Christian humanists and humanistic Christianity. And so we need to kind of tease this out as well. So let's kind of try. All right. And we'll use the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism and the alternate group, Secular Jewish Humanists, as an example of this. Secular Jewish humanists are humanists that are also culturally Jewish. But they want to be clear that they're not interested in the religious aspect of Judaism. So they're secular Jewish humanists. Now this contrasts with the approach used by the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism. Now what you need to understand very quickly is that the term is not humanist Judaism or humanism Judaism or not Jewish humanism. It's humanistic Judaism. So you still have Judaism, but the approach to that Judaism is humanistic. It's explicitly humanistic. It's not Reform Judaism. It's not conservative Judaism. It's not traditional Judaism. It's not Orthodox Judaism. It is humanistic Judaism. So when you go to a congregation for humanistic Judaism, most of the members of that congregation are probably also going to actually be humanist in their own right. But the question of whether or not there is a God or not is kind of irrelevant to these congregations. They're focused on living life in a Jewish way, in a humanistically Jewish way. And so if you do have an actual pairing of religion and taking a humanistic approach to that religion, you're going to see the word humanistic be applied. Because as soon as you hear the word humanistic, you know that you're not talking about kind of a full-fledged secular version of humanism. They're taking the parts of the philosophy that work and applying it to something else. The same thing happens, actually not just with humanistic Judaism and humanistic Christianity and so forth, but it also happens with humanistic psychology, humanistic sociology, humanistic medicine. It's taking humanism and applying it to some sort of human activity. So you're no longer talking about the philosophy as a philosophy. You're talking about the philosophy applied to some area of human endeavor. So you're also starting to see humanistic business management. So when you're not talking about the philosophy in total, you're talking about a limited application of the philosophy to some area of human endeavor where the discussion of religion or not religion is going to be irrelevant to it, like in psychology or in business management or in this humanistic Judaism. But we're going to be just equally concerned with rationality and ethics and personal responsibility and things like all the other aspects of philosophy, you're going to see the term humanistic, not humanism, humanistic. And that's the only time that you're going to see that theistic beliefs might encroach. Anytime there are theistic beliefs encroaching on the philosophy, it's a humanistic approach to the religion in question. But it's not humanism. Humanism is reserved for the secular, non-religious approaches. Right? So if you're thinking religious humanism as the term kind of makes immediate sense to you, you're actually thinking about a humanistic approach to religion, not religious humanism. And I know that's confusing. I understand it's confusing. All right, so you do have humanistic religions, people who approach their religion humanistically. And as a member of the humanist movement, even if you're very concerned with secularism, you should be encouraging this, because there's a lot of different ways people approach their religion. Some are better than others. I'm a humanist. I would much prefer people approach their religion in a humanistic way than in a fundamentalist way, for instance. And there's a lot of people of faith who feel the same way. And they need a term to differentiate their approach to their religion, to distinguish themselves from the approaches that they find abhorrent, which are the extremist forms of religion. So we need to be encouraging that the adoption of a humanistic approach to religion, but being aware that it's not humanism, it's humanistic approach to religion, right? And that's a very valid thing. The final thing that I want to talk about is transhumanism. Transhumanism is the idea that we could transcend the biological limitations of humanity, kind of bypass the evolutionary process and augment our biology, our lifespans, and eliminate our limitations as biological beings, and improve ourselves and improve longevity and improve humanity in the long term. Now, transhumanism is absolutely kind of based in what we would consider traditional humanism, the philosophic approach to humanism. The motivation for transhumanism is very humanistic. Is transhumanism truly a form of humanism? I think that's a little bit harder to answer. Because it all depends on the practitioner of transhumanism. In some ways, transhumanism can become kind of culty. They're waiting for something called the singularity where everything will get better. So it's almost like a religion. But on the other hand, you meet individual transhumanists, and they're very intelligent people, and they're motivated by all the same things that your average humanist is. So I think the jury's out on that. Every humanist I know is sympathetic to transhumanism and wary about transhumanism at the same time. So I think the jury's out on that. I don't think there's a consensus within the humanist movement on exactly what transhumanism is. But because it involves technology, biology, medicine, and it has to do with alleviating suffering and improving for the benefit of all humanity, I think we should pay attention to it and watch the research that they're doing with an open-minded skepticism, right? I think that's the best way to go. So I hope this Ask a Humanist About the Adjectives has been helpful. If anything is still unclear to you, ask a question. Bye-bye.